She promised it would never happen again. But once was enough to change everything. The night didn't feel dramatic. That's what made it harder to shake. Nothing was broken. Nothing was raised. No doors slammed. Just a room that felt slightly different afterward, like the air had learned something it couldn't forget. She stood near the window when she said it. The city lights behind her softened her outline, turning her reflection into something quieter, more human. Her arms were folded, not defensively, but carefully, as if she were holding herself together. When she spoke, her voice was calm, measured. It won't happen again. She didn't rush the words. She didn't dress them up. She said them like someone who meant it. I nodded, but my body didn't follow. My shoulders stayed tense. My hands stayed still at my sides, even though a part of me remembered exactly how they'd felt a few hours earlier, warm, certain, resting somewhere they hadn't before. The room was quiet in a way that felt intentional. A ceiling fan turned slowly overhead, clicking once every few rotations. Somewhere outside, a car passed, tires hissing against the pavement. Ordinary sounds, the kind that usually blend into the background. That night they felt amplified, as if the world was giving us space. I looked at her and she looked back, just long enough to acknowledge what we were both thinking. Not long enough to make it worse. The moment itself had been small. That was the strange part. No grand confession. No dramatic lean-in. Just a pause that went on a second too long. A hand that didn't pull away when it should have. A shared awareness that settled between us before either of us knew how to name it. And now, standing there, she seemed almost older somehow, not in years but in restraint. There was confidence in the way she held herself, but beneath it, something softer, something cautious, like she already knew what this could cost. I realized then that what unsettled me wasn't what happened. It was how natural it had felt. Weeks of easy conversations had led us there. Coffee that turned into dinners. Dinners that stretched into late nights where silence didn't feel awkward. She listened when I spoke, really listened. Asked questions no one else did. Treated my thoughts like they mattered, not like they were still forming. I told myself it was harmless. That closeness didn't have to mean anything. That admiration could stay where it was. But standing there, with her promise hanging in the air, I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit. Some lines don't need to be crossed twice to be real. Her gaze dropped to the floor, then lifted again. Steady. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She wasn't asking for permission. She was offering clarity. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't about temptation or impulse. It was about what happens after, when the silence settles and you have to decide who you're going to be now that something has shifted. The night ended politely. Quiet goodbye. No lingering touches. No last looks meant to pull the other back in. But as I stepped outside and felt the cool air hit my face, I knew one thing with unsettling certainty. Whatever had happened, however brief, it had already changed the tone of everything that came after. There was a pause after her promise, the kind that invites softness, the kind where most people would reach for reassurance just to make the moment easier. I felt the weight of that expectation pressing gently against my chest. It would have been simple to nod, to smile, to let things blur back into comfort. But comfort was the problem. I took a breath, slow and deliberate, like I needed to make sure my voice didn't betray what my body still remembered. Then I spoke. Once was enough. The words didn't come out sharp. There was no edge to them. If anything, they sounded quieter than I expected, almost careful. But they landed heavily between us, filling the space she'd just tried to calm. Her expression didn't change at first. Then her eyes softened, and I could see she understood exactly what I meant. I wasn't accusing her. I wasn't trying to rewrite what had happened. I was naming it, acknowledging that it mattered enough not to be repeated casually. My hands curled slightly at my sides. I could still feel the echo of her touch from earlier, the way it had grounded me in a way I hadn't been prepared for. That memory pulled at me, tempting me to take my words back, to soften them further. But I didn't, because saying nothing would have been easier, and easier wasn't honest. I'm not saying it was wrong, I continued, choosing each word carefully. I'm saying it changed something for me. She watched me closely now, her body angled toward mine, but she didn't move closer. That restraint meant more than if she had. It told me she was listening, not waiting for her turn to speak. There was a quiet strength in setting a boundary out loud. I hadn't expected that. I'd always thought boundaries were rigid, defensive things, walls you built when you were hurt. But this felt different. This felt like protecting something still intact. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with clarity. I told her I wasn't ready to pretend it hadn't meant anything, that I didn't want to walk forward as if it were just a moment that could be folded away and forgotten. I explained that I needed space, not from her, but from the pull of something I didn't yet understand. As I spoke, I noticed how still she'd become. One hand rested lightly against the back of a chair, fingers relaxed. Her breathing was steady. She didn't interrupt. She didn't rush me. When I finished, the room felt quieter than before. She nodded once, slow and thoughtful. Not in agreement exactly, but in respect. I realized then that this wasn't a rejection. It was a recognition of myself, of her, of the weight that even a single moment can carry when it's shared honestly. Saying once was enough didn't close a door. It defined the space around it. And in that space, uncomfortable, unresolved, but real, I felt something settle inside me. Not relief, not regret, something steadier. The knowledge that wanting something doesn't always mean you're ready to hold it. And sometimes, strength looks like choosing not to reach out again, even when part of you still feels the warmth of what it would be like if you did. That was the first thing that surprised me. She didn't rush to defend herself, didn't explain the moment away or soften it with humor. Instead, she exhaled slowly, like someone setting something down after carrying it longer than they realized. Her shoulders relaxed, not in defeat, but in acceptance. I understand, she said quietly. The words weren't heavy, but the honesty behind them was. She moved then, crossing the room with an unhurried grace and sitting in the chair across from me. Not too close, not too far. The distance felt intentional, respectful. She folded one leg over the other and rested her hands loosely in her lap, fingers brushing together as if grounding herself. For a moment, she stared at nothing in particular. Then she looked at me again, really looked, without expectation. You should know, she began, her voice steady but softer than before. I didn't plan it either. I didn't interrupt. Something in her tone told me not to. She spoke about loneliness, not dramatically, not as a confession meant to draw sympathy, but as a simple truth. She said that people often mistook her composure for completeness, that being confident didn't mean being immune to quiet moments that stretched too long, or conversations she wished she could have without filtering herself. I'm used to being the one who has it together, she said with a faint, knowing smile. Sometimes that means no one thinks to ask if I'm okay. There it was, the vulnerability she rarely allowed herself. As she spoke, I noticed how her posture changed, how the confidence remained, but something underneath it softened. She leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on her knees, as if closing a distance that wasn't physical. She told me the moment surprised her too, that it hadn't felt reckless, just human, and that scared her more than anything else. I didn't want to put that weight on you, she said, or confuse you. That's why I said it wouldn't happen again. Not to erase it, but to protect me from it. That realization settled slowly in my chest. I saw then how carefully she'd been holding herself back, not just from me, but from the possibility of wanting something that came with consequences she'd already learned to respect. Experience showed itself not in what she pursued, but in what she restrained. She shifted in her seat, turning slightly toward me, her knee angled in my direction without crossing the space between us. The closeness was emotional now, not physical. Somehow that made it more intimate. I don't regret the moment, she said gently, but I don't regret stopping either. Her eyes didn't waver. There was no plea in them, just honesty. In that moment, the age difference became clearer, not in years but in perspective. She had lived long enough to know that desire doesn't always deserve action, and that care sometimes means choosing restraint over impulse. I felt something in me loosen. The tension didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It wasn't confusion anymore. It was understanding. She wasn't asking me to cross the line again. She was trusting me with the truth of why it had existed at all. And somehow that trust felt heavier and more meaningful than if she'd reached for my hand. Not in the sense that we drifted apart, but in the way you walk more carefully after realizing how close you came to the edge of something. We still saw each other, still talked, still laughed in the same familiar rhythms. But now, there was awareness layered over everything, like a quiet hum beneath the surface. We were more deliberate. Coffee became coffee again, not an excuse to linger too long, not a reason to stretch the moment. When we sat together, there was space between our chairs, just enough to acknowledge what we were choosing not to do. And yet, I felt her presence more sharply than before. It was strange how restraint heightened everything. I noticed how she tucked her hair behind her ear when she listened, the small pause before she spoke when she was choosing her words. I noticed the warmth of her laugh, how it filled a room without demanding attention. These were things I'd seen before, but now they carried weight. Sometimes our arms would almost touch when we sat side by side. Not quite, just close enough that I became aware of the space itself. The absence of contact felt intentional, charged. My body learned the shape of that distance, learned how to hold still inside it. Once, she leaned in to show me something on her phone. The faint scent of her perfume reached me, subtle, familiar. She didn't brush against me. She didn't need to. My breath caught anyway, and I wondered if she noticed. If she did, she didn't comment. There were moments when our eyes met unexpectedly and stayed there a beat longer than necessary. Not challenging, not inviting, just acknowledging that we both felt it, the pull that hadn't disappeared simply because we'd named it. And then, almost simultaneously, one of us would look away. That too was a choice. Conversations deepened, somehow. Without physical closeness to lean on, words carried more responsibility. We talked about things that mattered, disappointments that still lingered, hopes that felt risky to say out loud. She asked me questions that made me pause before answering, not because they were intrusive, but because they deserved honesty. I found myself opening up more than I intended to, about uncertainty, about wanting to be taken seriously, not just seen as someone still becoming. She listened without correcting me, without framing my thoughts as temporary or naive. That respect settled into me quietly. At times, I caught her watching me when she thought I wasn't paying attention. Her expression wasn't longing, it was thoughtful, as if she were considering something carefully and choosing patience over impulse. The tension didn't fade. It matured. It became something steady, something that lived in the pauses between sentences, in the way we said goodbye without touching, in the shared understanding that we were holding something fragile without dropping it. One evening, as we walked side by side, our hands swung close enough that our fingers nearly brushed. I felt the instinct to reach out, felt it clearly, undeniably. I didn't, neither did she. And in that quiet restraint, I realized something important. Desire doesn't always demand action to prove it's real. Sometimes it reveals itself most clearly in the moments where both people choose to stay exactly where they are, together but careful, close but aware. And somehow, that space between us felt fuller than any touch ever could. The tension that had been quietly coiling between us finally found a moment to breathe. It wasn't sudden. There was no dramatic storm or raised voices. Just an evening that felt long enough for the unspoken to finally demand attention. We were sitting in her living room, the soft golden glow of the lamp spilling across the couch. Outside, the city had quieted, leaving only the distant hum of tires on pavement and the occasional flicker of neon from a storefront sign. In that stillness, every sound felt amplified, every heartbeat noticeable. I knew it was time to speak, not to accuse, not to clarify blame, but to be honest. To peel back the careful layers we'd been maintaining and show the raw edges beneath. I can't stop thinking about that night, I admitted quietly, keeping my gaze fixed on my hands folded in my lap. Not because I'm angry, but because it meant something. Her hand rested lightly on the armrest, fingers brushing against the fabric. She didn't reach for mine. She didn't need to. Her presence was enough. She tilted her head slightly, eyes attentive, inviting me to continue. I felt the weight of her patience. Steady, gentle, but undeniably present. I've been trying to put it out of my mind, I said, to pretend that it was just a fleeting moment, but it wasn't, and I can't pretend it didn't change something. For a moment there was silence. I felt the air thicken between us, heavy with honesty, and then lighter with relief. Her lips pressed together, as if holding back a response she wasn't ready to give. I understand, she said finally, voice soft. I didn't mean for it to affect you like that. It caught me off guard, too. Her words weren't defensive. They were measured, careful, and full of truth. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was acknowledging the moment's weight, owning it without apology. I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized something important. Her vulnerability was as rare as it was genuine. She had the confidence and composure that people noticed immediately, but this quiet honesty was something she only shared with those she trusted completely. I don't want to lose this, I said, my voice lower now. Not the connection, not us. But I also don't want to pretend that moment didn't matter. She shifted slightly, leaning forward, placing a hand lightly over mine. Not gripping, not demanding, just resting. The warmth of her touch anchored me, grounding the vulnerability in a simple, silent understanding. I don't want that either, she whispered. Her eyes searched mine, not for an answer, but for recognition. But we have to be careful. We need to be honest with ourselves about what we feel and what we're ready for. We sat like that for a long while, the quiet stretching between us. Foreheads almost touching, fingers lightly brushing, breaths synchronized but controlled. There was desire there, yes, but it was tempered by restraint, shaped by respect and awareness. In that room, with the city quiet around us, we allowed ourselves to be seen. Not perfectly, not without flaws, but honestly. And in that honesty, the tension that had been building for weeks finally became something beautiful. A bridge, not a barrier. Sometimes, confrontation isn't about arguing. Sometimes, it's about laying the truth between two people and letting it transform the space into trust. That night, it did exactly that. After that evening, things changed again, but this time quietly, purposefully. The air between us wasn't charged with unspoken tension anymore. It was filled with an understanding that had taken weeks to settle, a rhythm that existed without words, yet carried immense meaning. We met again on a calm Sunday afternoon, the kind where sunlight filters gently through half-open blinds and dust motes float lazily in the golden light. There was coffee on the table, untouched for now, and a soft playlist humming in the background. She sat across from me, posture relaxed but attentive, her hands lightly clasped in front of her. I've been thinking, she said, her voice even, but with a hint of warmth that made my chest tighten. About us, about what happened, and what it means going forward. I nodded slowly, because I had been thinking about the same thing. I could feel the pull in my chest, the desire to close the distance, to reach out, but I kept my hands still. I didn't need to touch her to feel the gravity of her presence. I don't want to lead you somewhere uncertain, she continued. And I don't want to ignore what we have. It matters too much for that. Her fingers flexed in her lap, small, unconscious movements that revealed the weight of her own careful restraint. I let a pause hang between us before speaking. I'm not ready to pretend it didn't matter either. That moment, it changed me, not in a way I regret, but in a way that's made me see things more clearly. About what I want, about what I'm willing to risk. Her eyes softened. She leaned forward slightly, not enough to bridge the gap, but enough that the closeness felt intentional. And yet, she said, we're still here, choosing to be careful. That choice matters, more than a moment of reckless closeness ever could. I realized then that this was the culmination of weeks of subtle negotiation between desire and patience. Every lingering glance, every near touch, every word spoken honestly without hiding emotion had led to this understanding. That love or connection doesn't always demand immediacy. Sometimes it asks for mindfulness. Sometimes it asks for respect for the other's heart as much as your own. We reached a moment of quiet. I watched her tilt her head slightly, letting the sunlight brush her cheek, casting a gentle glow that highlighted the softness beneath her usual composure. I reached over, not to grab her hand, but to brush a loose strand of hair behind her ear. It was the kind of touch that carried tenderness without urgency. She didn't flinch. She allowed it, small acknowledgement of the trust between us. "I don't want to rush anything," I said, voice low. "But I also don't want to ignore what we have." She nodded. "Then let's honor it. Honor what it is and what it could be, without forcing it, without pretending it's easy." We sat like that for a while, coffee long forgotten, letting the quiet fill the room. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't flashy. But it was real. It was acknowledgement, respect, and care in one steady moment. Sometimes, choosing what matters isn't about grand gestures. It's about restraint, honesty, and the willingness to stay present without destroying the balance. That afternoon, we both understood that the connection we had was worth patience, worth careful tending, and that the most meaningful love often grows quietly, in the spaces where respect meets desire. In that space, we didn't need to define the future. We only needed to honor the present, and in doing so, we both felt the deep, unspoken promise of something enduring. The weeks that followed weren't filled with dramatic gestures or sudden confessions. Instead, they were composed of quiet, deliberate moments. A kind of intimacy that doesn't announce itself but settles deep, where it's impossible to ignore. Every conversation, every shared glance, every gentle touch carried meaning without needing to be labeled. We met that evening on her balcony, the city lights twinkling below, soft and steady like a heartbeat. A warm breeze carried the scent of night flowers, brushing against our skin and threading through the strands of her hair. She had a mug in her hands, fingers wrapped around it, the heat seeping through to her palms. I sat opposite her, hands resting lightly on my knees, aware of how close the warmth of her presence felt even across the small distance between us. "I've been thinking a lot," she said, her eyes tracing the horizon before returning to mine. "About us. About this tension, this connection." Her voice was calm, measured, but there was a vulnerability in the pause before the words landed. I nodded, encouraging her to continue, though my chest tightened. I didn't need words to know we were standing at the crossroads we had both felt approaching for weeks. "I can't promise you certainty," she said quietly, her hand brushing the edge of the railing. "I can only promise honesty and respect. I can only promise that I'll be present, wherever we are, without forcing something we're not ready to claim fully." Her words weren't what I expected, but they weren't disappointing either. In fact, they brought a strange kind of relief. I had spent days wrestling with the desire to define us, to demand clarity, but here it was offered freely, in its truest form. A promise not of labels, but of commitment to care. "I don't need labels," I admitted. "I just need this. Honesty, presence, respect, and maybe patience. I can handle the uncertainty, as long as we're both willing to be here, really here together." Her gaze softened, a gentle warmth spreading across her features. She tilted her head slightly, letting the night breeze tousle a strand of hair behind her ear. Slowly, deliberately, she reached across the space and rested her hand near mine on the railing. Not pressing, not demanding, just presence. I felt the subtle warmth of her skin, the grounding comfort of a touch that spoke volumes without saying a word. We didn't speak for a long while after that. Words felt unnecessary. The city hummed beneath us, the soft glow of streetlights reflecting in our eyes. Every so often, our fingers would brush, accidental yet deliberate, a silent acknowledgement of the connection that had taken months to build. In that moment, I realized that love didn't always need certainty to be real. Sometimes, it existed in the choices you made quietly, choosing honesty over convenience, choosing patience over impulse, choosing presence over perfection. Eventually, she leaned slightly toward me, resting her forehead just above mine. I could feel the warmth of her breath, the softness of her cheek against mine, a slow, shared exhale, a silent understanding that whatever came next, we were committed to this, to each other, in this moment, even if the future remained unwritten. As we pulled back, our eyes met, lingering longer than before. A small smile curved her lips, mirrored by mine. Not a promise of certainty, not a guarantee of forever, but a recognition that, sometimes, choosing what matters most is simply choosing to stay present together. And in that quiet evening, with the city sprawling endlessly below us, that was enough.